Hi guys, Buildzoid here, and today we are taking a look at undisputable proof that I am a massive Sapphire fanboy. You might know a lot of people who have multiple Sapphire GPUs. Admittedly, most people don't have, like, 12 of them. Uh, But that's not that uncommon, to have multiple Sapphire GPUs. Again, not necessarily 12 of them, but having a Sapphire motherboard, that's a little bit, far more rare because there's very few people who are actually even aware that Sapphire tried to make enthusiast DIY motherboard. And I'm saying tried to make because I believe they stopped with, like, an A85X board. And if you're wondering what the hell A85X is, that's the FM2 Plus socket. So that was like the the late DDR3 AMD APUs. So, and as far as I'm aware, they never made an enthusiast DDR4 motherboard. So, yeah, they tried to do some DDR3 boards. This is one of them. There was also an X79 board. The X79 board is rarer than this board, at least in the UK. It's actually really weird. Like, I first saw the X79 board. Like, that was the first Sapphire motherboard I was aware of. But this thing's actually really common in the UK. Well, not really common, but I've seen two of them, and like two different ones. So, yeah, I consider this a relatively common motherboard, whereas the X79 one, I don't think I've seen a single one yet. Um, but yeah, so I picked this up because I'm a massive Sapphire fanboy, which is part of why I have so many Sapphire GPUs. And then it was just like, well, maybe to go with all of the Sapphire GPUs I have, I should get a Sapphire motherboard. I'm kind of annoyed that I technically don't really have a bunch of period correct Sapphire GPUs for this motherboard. If I had an X79 one, then it would go great with all of the 7970s I have, as well as the 290Xs. But yeah, this is like 6000, 5000 series, and I technically have a 587 Vapor X, but I have one of those, whereas I have like 579, six 7970 Vapor X's, not five, six. But anyway, actually, no. Those aren't 7970s, those are 280Xs, so that doesn't count. Anyway, yeah, so I picked this up because I'm a huge Sapphire, like I'm a big fan of the various Sapphire GPUs, and I figured, hey, let's try a Sapphire motherboard. Now they don't really like, Sapphire stopped making motherboards, like stopped trying to make enthusiast DIY motherboards because they didn't really get anywhere with that. As far as I'm aware, they were never really that great at overclocking, or maybe the people testing them just weren't really that good at it either. Like that's the other thing is like a lot of the methodology in old motherboard reviews is part like I'm not a fan of it. Let's put it that way. So anyway, yeah, I ended up with this one because it's kind of common. I'm maybe like if this one doesn't like physically, I'm not sure where I'm going with this video, but if this one doesn't leave me too disappointed, I might look into getting the X79 one because that one has a pretty funky VRM. I think that was like the last Volterra VRM to ever be on a motherboard. Um, yeah, let's take a look around this thing. So, it has a bunch of your, standard overclocking features: power button, reset button, clear CMOS button, dual BIOS switch, which is pretty neat. Like, that's actually pretty uncommon to get on X58 motherboards, even high-end ones. You get a postcode, right, as well as a beeper. The postcode is actually also one of those things that it's not really, like, I have a Rampage 3 Extreme, and if I'm not mistaken, that doesn't have a postcode, which is just like, what? But anyways, this does have a postcode, so that's really nice to have. So yeah, like at the time, this wasn't actually that common, which is really surprising. We've also got some troubleshooting LEDs up over here, though I'm not sure what those do. I've not bothered to check the manual. And hiding behind the DIMM slots, we have a bunch of voltage read points right along there, right? You can see those. So yeah, we've got all of the sort of basic overclocking features present on the motherboard. Then, of course, we have the VRM and Northbridge heatsink. Honestly, this looks decent in terms of surface area. Yeah, I mean, it's not the largest heatsink ever by physical volume, but for the amount of area it does take up, that this looks like a decent amount of surface area for how big it is. So that's our VRM heatsink. we're not going to talk about the VRM just yet, because before that, we're going to flip the board over. And this is where my first disappointment occurred when I got the board. Looking at the back of the board, that was the first disappointment. It's empty. So the whole reason why you have this cutout in the backplate for the CPU socket is so that you can have multi-layer ceramic capacitors for bypassing the CPU. Sapphire opted for not including them because they were too expensive, I guess. That's like the main reason not to include those caps. So yeah, I'm really not impressed with that. So that's like the first thing that really left me disappointed with this board, is just like, okay, they didn't bother with the bypass capacitors. And the thing is, like, this is not a high-end X58 motherboard. This is like a mid-range X58 motherboard. Well, yeah, no, I still wouldn't. I think the board was retailing for $200, which a lot of people would say is a lot of money for a motherboard, but I really wouldn't consider that a high-end motherboard. Like, high-end starts at like $350 up. Even back then, like, well, I'm not sure about high-end X58 prices, but like a Rampage 4 Extreme, which is that's not that much later after X58, it was $450 if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, $200 for a motherboard, like I would always consider that a mid-range price point. Anyway, and basically for as long as I've been into hardware, I've considered $200 to be sort of mid-range motherboards. So I can't really, like, so this is actually disappointing. For a $200 motherboard, I would consider that a pretty major disappointment right there. But at the same time, the other thing that sort of disappointed me is that this is a 6-layer PCB. I'm not sure this is gonna... Okay, that's not gonna show up on camera, is it? Yeah, no, I can give up on that. Anyway, there's a little label, just little indicator that this is the 6th layer of the PCB. The first layer has a little 1 in that area. And the thing is just like, okay, a 6-layer PCB, well, let's put it this way. I talked to somebody who has far more experience overclocking X58 than I do, and their words were basically all of the good X58 motherboards they've tried are 8 layers, at least 8 layers. And there's one exception to that, which is the Gigabyte X58-OC, which that's a 6-layer board, and that one is also good. So the thing is, the layer count here is not exactly confidence inspiring. It doesn't necessarily mean that the board has to suck, but more layers never hurt anything. So yeah, that's going to be interesting to see. And in terms of what that should affect, it should affect memory overclocking. It could technically slightly affect power delivery, but I don't think it'll make, like, that's the area I wouldn't expect too much of a difference in. It might affect Northbridge clocks. I'm really not sure about that. Again, I'm not great at X58 overclocking, which is arguably, like, that's good for this motherboard, because if I have a hard time overclocking on this thing, I'll just think it's my fault instead of blaming the motherboard for it. But yeah, already from a hardware perspective, I'm not super impressed with what's going on now. While the back of the CPU socket might be completely empty, the front is populated, which is the norm. Like, you wouldn't, like the thing is, on high-end boards you'd have the front and the back populated, so this really isn't well, this isn't, you know, anything particularly special. It's just kind of like, that's the bare minimum. Also, I hate this socket protector. This thing sucks. Anyway, yeah, so in terms of the capacitor configuration for the VCore VRM, I'm not impressed, right? We have no multi-layer ceramics on the back. We don't have anything fancy in terms of bulk capacitors either. These are just through-hole aluminum polymers, and there is only 10 of them, which, like, I think some of the boards out there, they have like 16 or something completely stupid. Like, they just fill out the entire space between the between the inductors and the socket with through-hole capacitors. So this right here is also like, this really doesn't inspire confidence. So yeah, I'm not really impressed with the power delivery decisions on this motherboard either. So yeah, it's a good thing I didn't buy, like, it's a good thing I mainly bought this for, you know, being a Sapphire fanboy, and not necessarily because I was expecting it to be a great overclocking board. The other thing is, I do actually think this is, like, visually, I really like this board. So on the, like, so if it ultimately sucks at overclocking completely, at least it looks nice. I like the thing is when it comes to motherboards, it's like I appreciate motherboards that don't try to hide the fact that they're motherboards, right? Like the capacitors are capacitor colored. The heat sinks, I mean, it has some basic color coordination going on, but it's not like most modern motherboards go out of their way to just cover everything up, and the capacitors are black so you can't tell, like, so that they try to blend in with the PCB, and it's just like, I mean, I get why, most people prefer that, but I prefer a motherboard that actually looks like a motherboard. So I really like the X58 EVGA motherboards for similar reasons. And, yeah, like a lot of those older motherboards where capacitors look like capacitors and heat sinks look like heat sinks and your PCIe slots, they're not a rainbow, but they are, somewhat color you have some basic color coordination going on with like DIMM slots and PCIe slots. So yeah, on the off chance that this completely sucks, at least it's going to look pretty in my collection, at least according to me. Let's talk about the actual power delivery, which at least is not the weakest point. Well, it's not. Technically, I think this is the weakest X58 VRM I have in my collection, but my collection of X58 motherboards is kind of top heavy, let's put it that way, because I have a Rampage 3 Extreme, I have a X58 Classified 4-way, I have a X58-OC, and there will be a video about that board. That'll be an actual PCB breakdown instead of something like this, because like I didn't see the point in doing something super detailed about a board like this, because I really don't have high hopes, but it is a board that it's just like, oh, this is kind of interesting. Sapphire made motherboards. I wonder if it sucks. It probably does, but we'll find out. But yeah, so I have a X58-OC, and then I have a X58 Extreme. So basically all of the other X58 boards I have are like top of the line for when they came out. And this really isn't. Though the X58-OC wasn't really that expensive, but it was really heavy on the overclocking focus. Like that board sacrificed everything for power delivery and overclocking features, and that's probably part of why it gets away with just being a 6-layer. Anyway, yeah, so the power delivery on this, we're looking at an 8-phase VCore VRM controlled by a UP... What is this? 6218. Okay, so we've got a 6218 voltage controller. And then we've got 35 amp DR MOS components from Renesas, and those are R2J20652 ANPs. This is, I'm not impressed. Like, I knew this was on some form of power stages. I was really hoping it would be on like 50s or something. But no, it's on 35s. And the thing is, these 35s are old. So they're not even like, these days you can get a 35 amp power stage that, outputting 35 amps produces maybe 5 watts of heat. These outputting 35 amps produce 8.5, like almost 8.5 watts each. So if this entire, like if you max out this entire VRM, as in you pull 280 amps at 1.3 volts out of it, with the controller switching the phases at 600 kilohertz, this VRM will produce almost 70 watts of heat. And it's supposed to be cooled by this. Which, yeah, that's not gonna fly. Unless you have a Delta fan on it. So that's not great. And yeah, that's kind of, but at the same time, at 200 amps output, it actually does okay. It'll only produce about 32 watts of heat at 200 amps output, so it's not a complete disaster. So for like ambient overclocking, it should be relatively okay. But yeah, like extreme overclocking, I think this VRM is gonna complain a lot. So yeah, and then I'm also not like, and then the output filtering is also not that impressive, and overall this whole thing is just kind of looking like, yeah, this was not a great, great purchasing decision, but who knows, maybe the BIOS makes up for it with like incredible memory overclocking capabilities, or it's just really easy to work with, one of the two. Like I'm hoping that there's something redeeming about this motherboard, because otherwise it's just kind of like, well, this is why you shouldn't fanboy any brands. Anyway, so yeah, that's the VCore VRM. Then for CPU VTT, we've got, is it CPU VTT? Yeah, that's what Sapphire calls it, so I'm going to call it CPU VTT as well. So CPU VTT, we've got a 2-phase using a UP6213. Is it a 6213? Yeah, it's a 6213. Yeah. So 6213, again, the same 35 amp DR MOS components, and I think for VTT this is actually plenty. I think there are some motherboards that technically have like a 3-phase VTT, but they're usually using like discrete MOSFETs, and so and not necessarily that great discrete MOSFETs. So the 35 amp DR MOS there should be okay. I'm not a fan of the fact that this doesn't come with heat sinks though. Like this VRM down here just doesn't have a heatsink, which again, I mean, ultimately you should probably, like considering how hot the VCore is going to get, you should probably have a fan maybe jammed in this area or somewhere. Like you should have airflow going down onto the motherboard anyway, just because the VCore VRM is going to run kind of hot. So this will get airflow from that, and it shouldn't run that hot as a result of that. But yeah, I would have preferred if it had a little heatsink on it. And then for memory power, we've actually got a really solid VRM. That's a 3-phase UP6213 again, and again the same 35 amp DR MOS components. So we've got plenty of memory power. Unfortunately, at the same time, like as DDR3 really doesn't pull that much power, and memory system like DDR power is not that difficult. Okay, you really don't need that crazy memory VRMs most of the time. Actually, no, there's a lot of really old DDR3 that pulls that gets like is actually pretty significantly power hungry. So we'll see. Or generally DDR memory systems really aren't that sensitive to having like super great power delivery. And it's more about like the BIOS and the actual trace layout, and that's where again the like the layer count of the motherboard gets into it. So yeah, we have a solid memory VRM. I'm not sure if that's actually going to help the board or make no difference. It certainly isn't hurting anything, but or at least it shouldn't be hurting anything unless there's some kind of major design flaw that isn't immediately obvious. But I'm really not seeing any like I can't think of it like see anything that I dislike about the way the memory VRM is set up. So I can't immediately see a problem with this. It's just kind of a case of this also doesn't necessarily like having a ton of memory power delivery doesn't automatically make your board good at memory overclocking. If it was that easy, then there'd be a lot of good memory overclocking motherboards out there. So yeah, that's basically all I have to say about this board. Oh, I guess I should have mentioned that actually what did kind of impress me is that this is on 0.5 millimeter thermal pads. The VRM heatsink is. Like, these are really thin, which is a good thing because basically, if your thermal pad is unnecessarily thick, that just increases its effective thermal resistance and it makes it less efficient at transferring heat from the power stages and the inductors to the heatsink. And speaking of from the inductors to the heatsink, thermal padding the inductors actually is surprisingly effective because inductors are basically big metal blobs, like big metal blocks that are, connected directly to the power stage through the switch node. So they're actually a pretty good way to try sink heat out of the power stages because the inductors themselves really shouldn't be getting that hot unless they're grossly undersized relative to how much current is going through them. But they can actually help, like you can transfer a significant amount of heat through the inductors that otherwise would be kind of difficult to get out of the power stages because the power, like otherwise you have to find some way to sink it directly out of the board. So yeah, like the actual way the VRM heatsink is like connected to the VRM, I'm a fan of that. Though the inductors aren't really that, like they went with through-hole inductors, which really makes them not as level as they could be, and you can't really. Oh, well, that's as low as the exposure goes, but oh, there you go. So yeah, you can see the imprints of the inductors aren't like super even. Oh, and I have autofocus off so that it wouldn't keep refocusing. Well, whatever. But yeah, you can see that the like imprints of the inductors aren't super even in the thermal pad because they went with through-hole inductors, and those just don't, they're not as consistent in terms of height compared to SMD inductors when you solder them to the board. So yeah, that's suboptimal for the thermal transfer, but hey, like they're getting, I don't think there's a single inductor that isn't getting any contact. It's just not super even. So yeah, that's kind of like, but still, it's nice that they're trying to sink the heat through the inductors, even though, that it's not exactly optimal with this style of inductor with how uneven these are. And yeah, so that's basically it for this motherboard. It's just, like, I really wanted to try out a Sapphire motherboard because, like, they're uncommon, and There's not a lot of great information out there about them, and at the same time, like I really want this board to be good. At the same time, I wouldn't really be surprised if it was just kind of, you know, average or even terrible. Um, but we'll see. Hardware wise, like it has, like the funny thing is, it's actually better equipped in terms of like it has a postcode, which my Rampage 3 Extreme doesn't have. It has the dual BIOS, which a lot of X58 motherboards don't have. The voltage read point, but then the rest of the feature set is kind of standard. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see how this works out. And yeah, I just wanted to take a look at this board because, well, I picked it up. So, and I couldn't figure out what to do with it in a video, and I didn't just want to leave it like lying around in my collection until I actually get around to overclocking with it. So, yeah, it's kind of just like, hey, Sapphire made motherboards. They apparently they aren't very good, but we'll see about that. Yeah. So that's it for the video. So I guess thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. You can support me there directly. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the HOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, stickers, posters, you know, the usual YouTuber merch. And there's a link to that down in the description below as well. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.